This is the Middle-earth philosopher. Morgoth and Sauron are synonymous with their relationship with the Elves, with humans being a close second, which is even more so during the Third Age with their encounters with Sauron. For most of his time in Middle-earth, Sauron's concern, as well as Morgoth's for a time, was with the Elves. However, what about the Dwarves? What was their relationship with them, or lack thereof it? Whenever the Dwarves are brought up, they seem to be a second-tier player in direct conflicts. And most times, if mentioned in war, it's not either with Morgoth or Sauron directly. But why is that? To get to the bottom of this massive discrepancy, one must understand the basics of their origin. As we all know, the Dwarves were originally created by the Vala Aule, and then given life out of mercy by Uru. However, that life didn't become active until after the Elves were born. That last bit is important because it's what starts the trend of Dwarven ignorance. Because they came to be at the last minute, as it were, the Dwarves were pretty much ignored by the Valar after this point. Even Ale isn't recorded as having much to do with them directly or influence them other than through the Dwarven religion, which stated that supposedly they would help join their creator in reshaping the world after the final war with Morgoth, something that has not happened. The Battle of the Powers during the primordial First Age was fought for the sake of the Elves, not the Dwarves, who presumably should have been awoken by this point. And this would also explain Morgoth's rivalry with the Elves as well, because his first major defeat was because of them, even though they were not directly involved. Moreover, according to the Silmarillion, Morgoth had already begun twisting Elves into the first generation of orcs beforehand, because he knew of Uru's plans for them as the firstborn. How even in their appearance there were reflections of his hatred of his creator, Uru. However, the Dwarves were not meant to be part of that original plan. They were an addendum, after the fact, and were not meant to be, as like I said, part of the original plan, when it's entirely possible that Morgoth was not even aware of their existence for quite some time. And even then, the fact that they were, albeit an unmerciful afterthought, probably downgraded the race in his eyes to ones not worth dealing with. After all, I mean, you got the Elves, who the Valar are simping over, going so far as to remove them from Middle-earth so they can be closer to them and protect them from Morgoth's influence. And then, to create even more beautiful things that Morgoth cannot. What do these diminutive, ugly-looking cave dwellers have to offer in comparison to that? Even after Morgoth returns to Middle-earth and kickstarts the Beleriand Wars, he still ignores them, preferring to go after the Elves and their human allies later on. Yet, this is more often than not a mistake. Despite being an afterthought of Uru, Morgoth underestimates the greatness that the Dwarves are capable of. Consider. It's because of the Dwarves that he doesn't overrun Beleriand outright before the Noldor arrive, because the weapon supply to the Sindar of Doriath was essential to the Sindar's victories during the First War, and their ability to hold out until Melian establishes her magical barrier. It is Dwarven trade that empowers much of the Noldor of the Eastern Beleriand territories and allows them to thrive. Furthermore, aiding in blockading Morgoth during the Siege of Angband. The Dwarves live in their cities in the Blue Mountains themselves, which allows them to weather the defeats that happen on the Eastern Front. And most importantly, Morgoth's greatest creation, if you will, the dragons, are vulnerable to Dwarven weapons, and they can also withstand their dreaded flame attacks that withers everyone else to ashes, even defeating Glaurung and somewhat salvaging the Eastern faction so that the survivors can then make their retreat. These are great accomplishments and do not get enough praise, I believe. Their actions in both direct and indirect nature hindered Morgoth's efforts through the final centuries of the age. They may not be as good looking or elegant as the firstborn, but Ale made his creation super tough, even to mental manipulation, and it could be argued that they were on the same level as the First Age Noldor, or at least very close. Sauron makes the same mistake during the Second Age. When falling back into his evil ways, the former general of Morgoth also regards the Elves as the chief threat to his designs to reorder a Valar-neglected Middle-earth as he saw it. We all know about his Rings of Power, but perhaps ought to forget that these were originally made for the mental domination of the Elves. The Dwarves only got their rings after that plan got fucked up. And even then, it still doesn't go according to plan because Sauron is unable to control them because, again, Ale made his creations super tough and extremely difficult to mentally control, near impossible. You would think that being a former apprentice of Ale, that Sauron of all people would have been aware of this, and he was probably cursing his former mentor all the while. However, Sauron doesn't underestimate them for long, unlike Morgoth. His wars with the Elves teach Demire the hard way that the Eldar weren't the only threats that he had to contend with in Middle-earth, and that Numenor and Khazad-dûm were just as, if not potentially more formidable, costing him time, resources, and orcs. The business end of Khazad-dûm Axis forces Sauron to acknowledge this threat, and sets his focus on taking them out as well, which never entirely succeeds, only forcing them back into their mountain strongholds, which, like his former master, Sauron cannot assail. During the War of the Last Alliance that closes out the Second Age, this acknowledgement, if you will, also shows in that Sauron recruits dwarves through his own faction that fight against the Alliance, which includes the Dwarves of Khazad-dûm. So at least Sauron was able to somewhat make a correction that his master did not. That said, however, by the latter half of the next age, the Dwarves seem to cease being a major power for some time before the Battle of Five Armies. Sauron expends most of his efforts instigating proxy wars against Ainur and Gondor, now regarding Númenóreans as a chief threat. Yet, still he doesn't ignore the Dwarves either for a second time, sending a force to eliminate Erebor, or at least keep them from reinforcing his chief target of Gondor during the War of the Ring. So, the relationship that the Dwarves have with these Ainur is complex. Both ignored the race to their own detriment, but one acknowledges the mistake and tries to fix it. And, in a fucked up way, in this acknowledges the importance that Dwarven culture overall has in Middle-earth, and that they're not just a second-tier race to a bunch of pointy-eared elvish princelings, or an easy-to-corrupt divided leaderless race of mortals. Rather, the Dwarves were arguably the most important, if not one of the most important, warrior cultures of Middle-earth, and maybe you can argue that they were the greatest warriors of Middle-earth. But what do you think? Do you think the Dwarves really were that important or made that great a contribution to Middle-earth's history? Or do you think that they deserve to be second place and were not worth mentioning? Let me know in the comments below. And this is the Miller Philosopher. You guys have a good day.